So going along with what I was talking about yesterday, should the internet be considered real life at this point? I'm 33 years old, and for me, I remember before and after the internet. We first got the internet when I was in 5th grade or so, and I really started using the internet regularly maybe by 8th or 9th grade when we got a cable modem. And at that time, the internet was completely like this anonymous other world. Anything that happened on there, you didn't treat it as if it were real life. So the things you said and did and the things other people said and did, you didn't think of it as an extension of them. It was more just their online persona. Kind of weird to think about is that text-based communication really was confined to just writing letters in the past. You knew that everything that everybody said was very thought out, and they knew that the reply would be weeks apart. But there was a very clear delineation between what you say in person versus what you're saying in a letter. Whereas something like messages on Facebook or text messages, we know that they've been edited to some degree, but there's only so much time and effort you can spend on that. And what's also interesting is that when you've talked to somebody online enough, you can almost have the cadence of what they're saying in real life just based on like how many words are in each message, how fast the messages come in. There's all these clues about how they're communicating what they're trying to say through like the speed of the message, the length of the message, punctuation of the message. And what's scary is like how much data Facebook has on what you've typed into the box and then decided not to type or change, because they have track of all of that stuff. Don't think that because you put it in there and then press send that they don't have track of that. So that's just a heads up in case you didn't know. And I'm not gonna make a judgment call on whether text-based or person-to-person communication is better, because just like anything, they have their pros and cons, right? I think the only danger right now is that when we communicate too often through text, we lose our ability to talk in person. Actually, let me rephrase that. You don't lose your ability to talk in person. It's just that you get better at what you practice. So like if you're always talking in person, you're gonna get better and better and better at that. But if you're good at talking on text and you never feel comfortable talking in person, you're never gonna develop those skills because you'll just automatically default back to text. It's like when people, they can tell you things through email, but they can't tell you face to face. I find it very troubling that we're willing to default to that. And not even so much that we're willing to, but we have that to default back to. All right, so where on earth was I going with this? I started out talking about, should the internet be considered real life? Is that an extension of real life and the things that we say and do on the internet? Should those directly correlate to you as a person in real life? Because I remember when, for lack of a better term, old people started using Facebook. Facebook is kind of like the domain of like my mom's generation now. Maybe, just anecdotally, that's been my experience. And I'll hear one of them complaining about something somebody else said online. And I always was just kind of like, yeah, but they said that on the internet. That doesn't mean that that's something that they really believe in. But for people who didn't grow up with the internet in the era where you could just say and do whatever you wanted, and it was like almost like an anonymous playground where nobody took each other seriously, they don't have that mindset. Somebody saying something on Facebook is something somebody's saying in real life. At this point, that anonymous internet playground that I grew up with, that is no longer a thing. And it's just kind of a strange thing to me, but at the same time, it makes perfect sense. And I think that it's just the way it's going, because I communicate with people online more than I communicate with people in person. Just by nature of the fact that I don't see that many people every day because I work from home. So for me to treat communication through the internet as if it were something other than real life would kind of be treating my actual life as not real life, if that makes sense. But it's weird though. I've said this before, but the internet is this very roundabout way of doing what we all want to do in the first place, which is just sit around and talk with each other and make things. With that being said, those are my thoughts on the internet. got a request to talk about the US Super Nintendo and the Japanese and European Super Nintendo. So in Japan, it's actually called the Super Famicom. I have one of those too. And in the US and in Europe, it is called the Super Nintendo, which you can actually see, it says Super Nintendo right there. First of all, I did not know that the European model looked just like the Japanese model until this thing came out. I know a lot of people don't like the look of this one. I actually think this one looks better, but it could be nostalgia talking because this is the one that I grew up with. The only thing I like better about this one is the color scheme. The color scheme on these buttons, like, it's so iconic. And it makes so much more sense now because I never knew that this was the Super Nintendo logo until years later. But the US Super Nintendo controller, while I don't really care for the purple color scheme as much, it still looks cool, but it also has these concave buttons, and I love that. It's like, it's weird how just differentiating between the top row and the bottom row makes for a different experience, but maybe it's just because I'm used to that, I don't know. But yeah, funny story about the Super Nintendo. I remember my cousins, they got a Super Nintendo, like not long after it launched, and I remember they had F-Zero, and one morning I got up before everybody else. We were at Brian and Andrew's house. It was like all the cousins were there, and I wanted to play it, but I couldn't figure out how to turn it on. You have to slide it up to turn on the power, and I was asking our oldest cousin, who he's like 10 years older than anybody else. I was like, how do you turn it on? He's like, you slide the thing. And I was like, slide the thing. And I kept trying to like push this as a button. And it's so interesting because like now that I look at it, that's a really bad design. How are you supposed to know that? Also, this is not my original console. This is one that Brendan had. It wasn't yellowing. He wanted to sell this, but he said, why don't you keep this one, sell your other one, and then give me the money for that. And I was like, okay. I grew up with the Super Nintendo design from the US, and this is the one that I think of when I think of the Super Nintendo. And I think it's great. I don't have any problem with it. Super Nintendo is just my favorite system. The game that I was talking about yesterday, Undertale, the guy who made that game, it's very much inspired by the role-playing games that were on the Super Nintendo that I grew up with as well. But yeah, Super Nintendo's great, man. An awesome system. That's it for today's vlog. Thank you very much for watching. Don't have anything left to say. See you tomorrow.
Bacon. It tastes of wood. You can.
See my reflection. My finger pointing. It's like a finger pointing at the moon.